Tupac Shakur's final week on this earth is the kind of story that feels like it was written for a movie script, except it was real life, raw and brutal. To understand the tragedy, you can't just start at the hospital bed or the red light on Flamingo Road. You have to go back to that night in Las Vegas, a city glowing with neon lights and heavy energy, where Tupac was supposed to be celebrating life, but instead walked straight into his destiny. September 7th, 1996 wasn't just another night. Tyson had just destroyed Bruce Seldon in less than 2 minutes, and the crowd at the MGM Grand was still buzzing like they'd witnessed history. Tupac was there right at ringside, rocking with Suge Knight and the Death Row entourage. On paper, it looked like a night of glory. In reality, the fuse had already been lit. The spark came in the MGM lobby. Orlando Baby Lane Anderson, a Southside Compton Crip with fresh history against death row, showed up like a ghost that couldn't be ignored. Earlier that year, Anderson had tried to rob one of Tupac's guys, Trayvon Lane. The streets never forget that kind of disrespect, so when Trayvon spotted Anderson, the confrontation was automatic. Tupac, fired up with adrenaline and maybe trying to prove loyalty to the death row family, was the first one to throw a punch. Cameras caught it, the stomp that followed was messy, and Orlando walked out humiliated in front of the world. That single decision, one punch thrown in a hotel lobby, set the chain reaction in motion. Tupac wasn't known for starting fights. Friends said he wasn't usually the one leading violence, but that night he acted differently. It was loyalty, not gang life, that pushed him into it. Suge Knight should have kept him away, should have remembered that Pac wasn't just a soldier, he was the million-dollar voice of death row. Instead, the message became clear: if your crew swings, you swing. After the scuffle, Pac headed back to the Luxor Hotel to regroup. He changed out of his orange silk shirt into a green basketball jersey and had a quiet word with his fiancée, Kidda Jones. He told her to stay at the hotel, not to come along to Club 6162. Nobody knew it at the time, but that decision probably saved her life. By 10:50 p.m., Suge Knight were rolling down the strip in a black BMW, a convoy of death row cars following behind. Frank Alexander, Pac's bodyguard, wasn't in the same car. Tupac had literally stopped him, handed him keys, and told him to drive with the outlaws. That moment would haunt Alexander for the rest of his life. A routine police stop around 11:05 slowed them down. Officers pulled Suge over for blasting music too loud and missing plates. Ironically, that too loud music was unreleased tracks from Tupac's Machiavelli project, songs nobody else had even heard yet. The cops let them go with a warning. Then came the red light. At 11:15, Tupac was leaning out of the passenger side window, flirting with women in the next car, smiling like he didn't have a care in the world. That's when a white Cadillac crept up, 4 men inside, the back window rolled down, and the night exploded. Gunfire ripped through the air, 12 to 13 shots cracking into the BMW. Pac took 4 of them, 2 in the chest, 1 in the arm, 1 in the thigh. 1 bullet punched his lung. Suge got grazed by shrapnel, but somehow kept control. The BMW swerved, tires shredded, and Suge made a wild U-turn, blood dripping down his head as he tried to save both their lives. The image of Tupac slumped in that seat, struggling for air, is burned into history. Officer Chris Carroll was the first to reach the call. He asked, "Who shot you?" Carroll swore. Tupac looked him dead in the eye and whispered, "F you." Moments later, Pac slipped into unconsciousness. Some swear those were his last words, others who were there say they never heard it. The truth remains twisted in contradiction, just like the rest of Tupac's story. What followed wasn't just a shooting. It was the beginning of a 6-day vigil, a fight for life that pulled hip-hop family and enemies into one place. The streets outside buzzed with paranoia, while inside, doctors were cutting, stitching, and trying to keep the most powerful voice of a generation alive. Tupac Shakur had survived so much already: poverty, prison, and even previous shootings, but this time, destiny wasn't giving him an easy out. 600 words. The emergency room at the University Medical Center in Las Vegas turned into a war zone the night Tupac Shakur was rolled in. Nurses and surgeons had seen plenty of gunshot cases before, but nothing like this. The man on the gurney wasn't just another victim of the streets, he was one of the biggest cultural figures alive, bleeding out under the blinding white lights. Doctors worked for hours, opening his chest to repair damage, fighting against massive internal bleeding. Tupac had already lost one lung by the time surgeons finished their desperate procedure, but he was still alive. Inside those walls, the mood was tense but strangely hopeful. Afeni Shakur, Tupac's mother, arrived quickly. She had spent years as a Black Panther and knew too well what it meant to fight against impossible odds. Her face stayed composed, but everyone who saw her could feel the weight of her fear. For her, Tupac wasn't just a rap icon, he was her son, the child she had raised in chaos, the boy she had once carried through poverty and revolution. Now she stood watching doctors battle to keep him from slipping away. Suge Knight, patched up with minor wounds, came in with stories of Tupac talking during the car ride, still conscious, still fighting. According to him, Tupac was asking about everyone else, trying to make sure others were okay, even as he gasped for breath. That was the kind of detail that stuck with people later. This idea that even in the worst moment, Tupac's instinct was to protect. Whether all of Suge's words were true or not, they added to the myth of Tupac as someone who simply would not quit. The hospital filled quickly with familiar faces. Members of the Outlaws stood watch like soldiers, convinced the shooters might come to finish the job. Paranoia wasn't paranoia in their world, it was survival. Anyone could walk through those doors, and the thought of enemies striking again in the hospital was not far-fetched. So they guarded the hallway, tense and armed with nothing but loyalty. Then came the stream of stars, artists, and friends who had been shaped by Tupac's voice. Snoop Dogg's arrival left an impression on everyone who witnessed it. He was overwhelmed, barely able to stand when he first heard the news, but Afeni held him up, telling him to be strong. In that sterile hospital room, she comforted him even while her own son lay fighting for his life. Snoop sat beside Tupac, whispering encouragement, hoping his words would cut through the haze of pain and coma. Idada Jones, Pac's fiancée, stayed by his bed with music playing. She put Don McLean's Vincent on repeat, believing the familiar melody might pull him closer to consciousness. She swore there were small reactions, little movements or groans when he heard her voice. Whether it was real response or just the body's reflex, didn't matter. For her, it was proof that Tupac was still in there, still fighting. But the reality was grimmer than hope suggested. Doctors had to put him in a medically induced coma after repeated surgeries because his restless nature wouldn't let him stay still. He kept trying to rise from the bed, tugging at tubes as if his spirit was too stubborn to surrender even when his body demanded rest. On September 9th, surgeons made the brutal choice to remove his right lung completely. The hope of recovery dimmed with every passing day, though the people around him clung to miracles. Outside the hospital, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Crowds gathered, reporters hovered, and whispers turned into headlines. The East Coast-West Coast rivalry had already made hip-hop feel like a battlefield, and now one of its greatest soldiers was on the edge of death. Fans lit candles, prayed, and traded rumors. The sense of loss was already creeping in even before the final announcement. Inside, Afeni carried herself with the calm of someone who had lived through battles before. She spoke to doctors, listened to every update, but also made it clear she didn't want her son kept alive just to suffer. For her, Tupac's freedom mattered more than clinging to machines. By September 13th, his body had reached its limit. He went into respiratory failure, revived 3 separate times before Afeni made the agonizing choice. 3:33 p.m., Tupac Shakur was pronounced dead at only 25 years old. The news tore through the world like shrapnel. People cried in the streets, radio stations played his music non-stop, and the hip-hop community fractured under the weight of grief and suspicion. Friends like Kendrick Wells remembered the hope they had felt just hours earlier, crushed instantly by the final word. The streets had lost more than a rapper. They had lost a voice that had turned their pain into poetry. A leader who carried both fire and vulnerability in his art. The aftermath of Tupac Shakur's death didn't feel like a conclusion. It felt like the start of a storm. The official cause was respiratory failure and cardiac arrest brought on by his gunshot wounds, but that explanation was never enough for the millions of people who had followed his life. Within hours of the announcement, rumors and conspiracy theories began spreading faster than the news itself. Some swore he was alive, claiming his cremation had been arranged too quickly. Others pointed to contradictions in witness statements and wondered who was really behind the killing. The first shock came with how swiftly Tupac Shakur arranged for Tupac's body to be cremated. That very night, Davis Mortuary carried out the process, leaving no chance for a public wake. Suge Knight would later say that Tupac wanted a wake, while Afeni insisted otherwise. The decision raised eyebrows, feeding the idea that something about the situation wasn't being told. To fans who already saw Tupac as larger than life, the lack of closure was unbearable. On the streets, stories circulated that some of his closest friends rolled his ashes into a blunt and smoked them in tribute. Whether true or just myth, it captured how deeply unconventional and personal the mourning process was for those in his inner circle. For them, Tupac wasn't just an artist to be honored with flowers and sermons, he was family, and family in their world was remembered in raw, rebellious ways. The hunt for answers quickly focused on Orlando Anderson, the Crip who had been stomped out in the MGM lobby just hours before the shooting. Police saw motive written all over his bruised face. The streets agreed, but Anderson was never formally charged. When Afeni filed a wrongful death lawsuit against him, Anderson denied involvement. 2 years later, he was killed in a gang shootout, taking whatever secrets he carried with him. The lack of justice cemented the case as one of the most frustrating mysteries in music history. In 2002, a Los Angeles Times investigation suggested the Southside Compton Crips retaliated for Anderson's beating, with Anderson himself as the shooter. It seemed straightforward, but then came the contradictions. Suge Knight, the only living person inside the BMW with Tupac, kept changing his story. Sometimes he said Anderson wasn't the gunman. Other times he hinted at conspiracies but refused to name names. His refusal to cooperate with investigators left the case tangled in shadows. The wildest claims came from within the industry. Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, Anderson's uncle and a longtime Crip, admitted in interviews and even in his memoir that he was in the Cadillac the night Tupac was shot. He said Anderson fired the weapon, though he never outright confirmed who pulled the trigger. His confession, half boast and half testimony, gave investigators leverage decades later. In 2023, Davis was arrested and charged with murder, accused of aiding and abetting the crime. The move reignited interest in the case, but also deepened suspicion that powerful figures had benefited from Tupac's death staying unresolved. Keefe D's interviews added another layer of fire. He claimed that Sean Diddy Combs had once offered $1 million bounty on Tupac because of the East Coast-West Coast rivalry. Diddy denied it, but the story stuck. Former bodyguards spoke of mysterious checks, untraced money, and government indifference. The idea that corporate and industry power might have played a role made the case feel less like gang retaliation and more like assassination. Even Tupac's father, Billy Garland, had bitter words about the investigation. He accused Keefe D of being nothing more than a government pawn, someone willing to trade secrets for protection. To Garland, the arrest was less about justice and more about the system using the streets to close a case they had neglected for decades. Through it all, Tupac's image only grew. Murals went up in every major city. His music kept climbing charts, every lyric feeling prophetic in hindsight. Only God Can Judge Me, Hail Mary, Life Goes On. Songs that once sounded like defiance became elegies. Fans argued he had predicted his own death, pointing to the Machiavelli album, which arrived just weeks later, filled with themes of rebirth and martyrdom. Some insisted the Machiavelli persona was proof that Tupac had faked his death, living in secret under a new identity. What was undeniable was the cultural hole he left behind. Hip-hop lost not just a star, but a bridge between anger and art, chaos and meaning. Tupac's words had reached beyond music, touching politics, race, and the everyday struggles of survival. He was raw enough for the streets to claim him, and poetic enough for scholars to study him. His absence made the East Coast-West Coast feud feel even more pointless. endless, exposing how much blood had been spilled without resolution. The murder trial of Keefe D is set for 2026, and maybe it will answer some questions, but for many, no courtroom will ever deliver the justice Tupac deserved. Too many witnesses are dead, too many stories have been twisted, and too much money and power have clouded the truth. What remains is the legacy of a young man who lived fast, fought hard, and left behind verses that still shake speakers around the world. Tupac Amaru Shakur died at 25, but in spirit he never left. He became a myth, a question mark, and a legend all at once. In every city where his lyrics are shouted in unison, in every mural where his eyes follow you down the block, Tupac's presence lingers, untamed, unforgotten, and immortal.